probably the same shirt and has a ponytail.
Oh.
And my first thought was, this is not what I expected a State Department diplomat to look like. But we had a great first conversation. I'd actually love to hear what Chris thought of me. But we ended up going to a bar a few weeks later for a drink just to get to know each other. And what was meant to be 30 minutes ended up turning into 3 hours. And we knew that there was something special about our early friendship. So yeah, Chris, I'd love to hear what you thought when you met me.
Well, Jordan, first of all, it's a man bun, not a ponytail, but thank you very much. But yeah, no, so I had come from DC and the State Department in particular, which is a place that many military folk pass through. So when I first met Jordan, my first impression was that this guy carries himself like a vet. But he also had a very, very warm way about him. Not that vets aren't warm, but he had this very winning smile. And when we shook hands, it was just friendship right away. But it really wasn't until that next evening that we had a chance to really dive deep on our California upbringings, our love of literature, our love of war reporting. In fact, Sarah has probably heard me talk about this before, how I've always desired to be a Dexter Filkins or an Anthony Shadid. And actually, before I get any further, I want to say it's such a pleasure to have you here, Sarah. I met Sarah in 2013 when I was just an intern at the White House. And I remember walking in on day one thinking that I was pretty good at this speechwriting thing, even though I hadn't written a speech before. And literally on day one of Sarah's speeches came across my desk and I read it. And I realized how far I had to go. And Sarah, ever since, has been helping me get closer and closer to that goal. So it's such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Well, you are a natural, and I didn't take much help. So I appreciate, but thank you for the kind words. So, okay, so this is how you met. Now you guys are friends. Tell us about the journey in this book. I mean, how did this start? Like, you just decided to jump in a car and drive across the country? I mean, how many road trips did you actually take, and what were you looking for out on the road?
Yeah, so we went on the first road trip in May 2016, and that was approaching the presidential election. We had found that the few months before that, every conversation was coming back down to politics, no matter where it started. And they often left with one of us red in the face. And that was true for everyone around us. Everybody was fighting all the time. Every news station was 24/7 politics, and it was heated and divisive. And serendipitously, thank you to my sister, she was getting married in LA, and I had to be there for her wedding on May 28th. And I decided I wanted to drive. And so one night I asked Chris if he wanted to go with me. And we ended up setting off on this 7-day road trip across the country. My mother was very upset and made me promise multiple times that I would get there before the rehearsal dinner. And we found that on the road, we were able to have these great conversations again. And the noise turned down. And over long drives, we can kind of dive deeper into these bigger issues that we cared about. And we also found on the way that we met all these people who were warm and hospitable and gave us a different view on the country. And we felt that there was something really special seeing America from the road, especially during this very divisive time. And as we finished that trip and ultimately decided to do more, we came to feel that this was helping our friendship, that it was making us better people, better friends. And we wanted to take some of the lessons we were learning from each other and the people we met along the way and turn that into a book that could help everyone kind of reach the same common ground.
All right. So, and Chris, do you want to add anything, or we're good?
Yeah.
We're done?
Well, no, I'll only add that it wasn't until the second road trip that we really decided that there was a book in this. So on the first road trip, we decided, wow, there's really something to being out here on the road. We're learning so much. We're able to talk. And then we decided to take another one. The next summer, we decided to go out and we'd say, look, let's go headlong into politics. Let's try to dive into the middle of things. And maybe we'll find some answers to, how a bipartisan friendship can survive in this day and age. So we ended up at a Trump rally in Phoenix, Arizona. And we were both surprised that we saw the same things. When we were in the rally, we looked around and we said, wow, the president is really moving these people in person with his flock. He's very charismatic. But then we were also sort of worried about what we saw at the edges of that rally. When we went outside, we were both inspired by the civic activism going on in the streets. But we were also really worried when the tear gas canisters started flying and the water bottles started flying, and it turned into a violent affair. and the masks started coming down. And that was our first indication that there was probably something to be said here. The fact that we could see the same things, that we could agree on facts and what had occurred was really beguiling. But then when those tear gas canisters started flying, and when the civil conversations on the fringes started to turn into angry shouting matches, it became obvious that we had to go find people who were not engaged in the professional act of politics or the semi-professional act of politics, and talk about other things like culture and our values and what we want out of life and the American dream. And that is when Union was born.
Lovely. So you guys meet a lot of characters on your journeys. You meet Trump diehards, you meet truckers, you meet community activists and prisoners. And I'm curious, who sticks with each of you the most?
That's a great question. And it's one we've gotten a few times now. And we were just reflecting that our answers keep changing. And I think it's just whatever comes up for us. And I think for me, the one who I've been thinking about recently is Rodrigo Rojas, who is the director of community relations at the Gathering Place, which is a big public park in Tulsa. And we first met, we called him Rigo, in 2018. And we were planning on just driving through Tulsa. We had no intent to stay. And one person asked us to give him 24 hours to set up some meetings for us. And he wanted us to explore the city. And one of the people we met was Rigo. And the Gathering Place, which is this massive national public park that everybody across the city kind of came together to help build, was just being developed. And we talked to Rigo about what his hopes were for this space. And he kept telling us, I hope that it's a place where people from all across the city could come together and mingle. And he viewed it as this amazing effort to unite the Black and white communities across Tulsa and some of the immigrant populations. The city had some recent ordinances that were harmful to the local immigrant population, and the city itself has had tensions for a long time. But he was so hopeful that this could bring people together. And a year later, when we went back to Tulsa for our last road trip, we saw him again. And if on the first trip he was wearing a hard hat because it was in development, the second trip, the park was done and it was open, and he gave us a tour, and he had a smile from ear to ear because people from all across the city were there, and they were engaging in exactly the way he had hoped. And it really had brought the city together in this incredible way. And it was so wonderful to see that came to be, and what he wanted to do in order to help forge those local bonds had turned out well. And I've been thinking about him recently because it must be so painful to now have the pandemic, and his hopes for this park are probably not being realized at the moment. And yet, the hope is still there that as soon as this is over, that space is there for the city to come back and reunite. So I've been thinking about him.
Along those lines, I've been thinking of someone else we met in Tulsa on that very same trip. In fact, maybe even that very same day. And if she's on this call, she's probably gonna be very embarrassed that I'm bringing her up, but I'm sorry. But I'm actually not all that sorry. Her name is Mimi Tarashik. Is that right, Jordan? Is that the Tarash? Excuse me, I always screw that up. Mimi is how we call her. And Mimi is the director of Women in Recovery, which is a prison diversion program intended for mothers mainly who are facing jail time. And instead of going to prison, which all too many women in Oklahoma do. In fact, they have one of the highest incarceration rates for women in the country. Mimi and her team offers them wraparound services, including job training, mental health services, everything they could possibly need, and creates this rigorous program to try to help them get out of their addiction and avoid jail time. And Mimi was a very hopeful character to us, a hopeful person, because she's doing the work of trying to improve not just the lives of the women that come through her door, but Tulsa, and as a result, Oklahoma and the country beyond. But I think what often reminds me of Mimi these days is something she said when we were talking to her one night. We had just Jordan and I had just come from Detroit, where we had spent time with actually a group of women who together had spent nearly a century in prison when you add it all up, and a group of men that were still in prison and talking about and thinking about their lives when they came out. And the idea of having been in prison for that long and coming out and seeing the new Detroit was just really bothering me. The fact that how dislocating that would be, and how difficult that would be. And I asked Mimi, I said, how do you deal with all of this? How do you get rid of all this pain and this burden of witness? And she looked at me and she said, that's not going to happen, and I don't want it to happen. I don't want you to lose that. I want legislators to feel it. I want everyone to feel what it's like to have spent this time in prison or deal with these addictions, and to deal with all these problems that, you know, the United States faces. Because when you do, then you do something about it. Then you act. If you can't ignore it, then you have to do something about it. And that's really been sticking with me, especially in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, and this COVID experience that we're going through, this COVID pandemic, and that desire, that need to act. When you witness it, you can't help but do it.
Yes, no, that's exactly right. You know, it's funny, you're talking about race, you're talking about COVID, you're talking about some issues that are tough right now. And many of us have this feeling like we can't talk to each other about issues like these anymore. But you two actually tried to overcome that division. And I'm curious about what you guys learned about how to talk to each other across the ideological divide. You know, how do those lessons scale to other people?
Great question. I think scale is really hard, and it's something that we've wrestled with. I don't think there are any silver bullets to this. There's no set of regulations or policy changes that are going to somehow make this work. But we did learn some lessons in our own conversations that we think everybody can adopt. The first was we found that every time we entered a conversation with the intent to change the other person's mind, the conversations devolved into a tit for tat political combat where each of us was trying to win. And as a result, we weren't actually listening to the other side. We were waiting for our chance to make our next point, and not really hearing the other person as we were talking. And so over time, we learned that those conversations were just never going to go anywhere and would leave us angry. And so instead, we moved away from them, and we tried to only talk about politics when we thought there was something deeper we could explore and that we might learn from the other person. And so in the end, as we entered more and more of these conversations, we did so in an effort to try to understand where our own blind spots were, what were things that we could learn from the other person's perspective. Second, we found that whenever we entered a conversation with an assumption about what the other person believed, because they're a Republican or a Democrat, those assumptions turned out to be wrong. Like, usually people were much more complex and their views were much more nuanced if you gave them time and space to articulate them. And it's usually the effort to kind of score a point that doesn't allow the other person to actually reveal the nuance of their positions. And so it led us to this sense of humility about what other people might believe. And so our second recommendation is, whenever you enter a conversation with someone about politics, try to remain humble about what you assume they believe. That point was really driven home to us by this truck driver named Pete, who we spent a week in a long haul truck with. Pete, when we first met him, was wearing a "Make America Great Again" shirt. And after spending 5 days with him, we found that, you know, whatever we could have predicted about his political beliefs from that shirt would have turned out to be wrong. He faulted the president for not believing in climate change. He railed about the injustice of not having universal health care. He felt that while his faith told him gay marriage was a sin, that actually there was a higher commandment to love everyone. So he supported his daughter, who was a lesbian, and his sister, who's a lesbian, in their marriages. So he was a very nuanced, complex person, and it took time for us to unravel that. And we wouldn't have learned it if we had just met him at a rally where we were shouting back and forth at each other. And then third and finally, at some point we learned to look for the deeper experiences that motivate why people are coming at a certain issue the way they did. If in our arguments, I looked at Chris as a Democrat and he looked at me as a Republican, we would often get locked into these kind of tribal arguments about why your ideology says X and mine says Y. But if instead we looked at each other as people with deep beliefs and experiences that motivate how we're coming at this. So for me as a Marine, or for Chris as a journalist, we were able to have deeper empathy for why on various issues, especially ones that are very fraught, like race or class or deep divides that the country is facing, we would have an easier time discussing them because it came from a respect for that deeper identity and not this sort of political combat.
Yeah, and Jordan just gave you 3 tactics, and I have two sort of larger strategies that we also used to great effect. And one of them was change the setting. Um, that's the beauty of the road for us. You know, we got out of the sort of debate circles we were in New Haven when we first met. We were going into strange new places, which automatically humbles you. And there's no talking points for how you're supposed to relate when you're eating almonds somewhere in the wastes of Nevada or somewhere else in this country. And we found that with Pete. I mean, for example, I got along famously with Pete at a certain point because there's just no script for how a Trump supporting truck driver from Daytona Beach, Florida is supposed to talk to a Berkeley liberal with long hair from Berkeley. And you immediately start trying to find the humanity in the other person. It's only natural, it's only human. The other strategy is to keep coming back to the table. That was another advantage of the road for Jordan and I, is that when you're on a 7-day road trip and you have a fight in the first hour, you got a lot of time to kill between then and getting to the end of your trip. And so you're forced to come back to the table. You're forced to think about what you had just said, what was just said to you, how you might have done it better. Wait a second, maybe I should have rethought what I just did there. Maybe I should apologize. And so coming back to the table, not thinking that you're going to solve all the world's issues in that first fight or that first debate or that first conversation. It also allows you to get away from politics for as long as you possibly can, which is usually a salve for fraught relationships. And yeah, apologizing, like saying, Mimi, I'm sorry I butchered your last name. I mean, that's the other one too.
Excellent tips. I think very useful. I think those are scalable tips. Maybe not the road trip necessarily, but I think just the approach. Both of you have mentioned race so far, and obviously I think some of what makes our politics so intractable is our country's history on race. And as 2 white guys from California, how did that play into your time on the road? Like, how has the recent focus on police brutality all across America changed the way you think about that message in your book?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the most enduring fights that Chris and I had, and this is reflected throughout the book, is this disagreement we had going into it about whether America was sort of vibrant, healthy, strong, or whether it was unraveling, kind of flawed, and ultimately going to come apart. And I think that is underpinned by this deeper question about racial injustice and socioeconomic differences and these deeply rooted problems we have as a country, and even more by our history and how we approach that history. And I think it's reflected in sort of these two positions that have seemed to lock Republicans and Democrats into at the moment, where Republicans kind of approach things with this language of patriotism. They want to believe that the country is good and healthy and that our history is noble and worth cherishing. And Democrats highlight the people who've been left out of America's bounty and the issues in our history and how they haven't really been fully wrestled with, and we're seeing the legacies and scars today. And that fight between Chris and I kind of played out over the course of our travels. And it was this animating question for us. And I think ultimately, the place where we really found some, I don't want to say resolution, but where we really came to understand it at a deeper level was in Tulsa. And Tulsa had this powerful impact on us because it's a city that has been riven by race and class issues for over a century. And we learned while we were there about the Tulsa race massacre in 1921, which was something I had never heard of. I'm an American history buff, and I had never heard about this in any of my schooling. And yet the population in Tulsa today, despite all the problems, they have a group of young civic leaders and old civic leaders who are bringing that conversation to the surface. And especially for the centennial next year, they're trying to make the story of the race massacre not just a part of Black history or even just a part of Tulsa's history, but a part of American history, and to locate it in this broader struggle. And we had this great conversation with Jamal, who's a pastor, who told us at one point that progress begins with having the conversation, with being able to talk honestly about what happened, so that we can all understand what the issue is, and then we can move forward together. And he was kind of helping lead that effort in the city, and they were talking about it openly and honestly. And having tried to get away from politics and to see people where they were and what mattered to them, I think we're not surprised to see what's going on today, because there were all these feelings and latent issues that haven't fully been wrestled with in the public sphere that are now coming to the surface, and they're being aired. And it's messy, and it's hard and challenging, and it's running up against those two different approaches to our history and our sense of who we are. But we can't move forward together until it is aired out, and we do really reckon with what happened and that legacy. But then we can move forward together, and I think we're from what we saw and what we saw people on the ground doing, we are hopeful for that. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll just add, look, we drove 20,000 miles to write a book about unity and hope. As Jordan said, I set out, when we set out on the road, I set out as a pessimist, or as a skeptic, as I like to call it. Jordan calls me a pessimist. I say it's a skeptic. And really where we found that hope was in that activity. It was in the fact that this is a nation of workers. This is a nation of not blue collar workers, yes, but I'm not talking about just work. I'm talking about rolling up your sleeves and doing the work of bringing us together, of forging a better path forward, of talking about where we've come from and where we could go. And we found that in the voices of the people in Tulsa and the people in Detroit and elsewhere who are dealing with the worst of this country, the most difficult parts. And they were the most hopeful. They were the most active. They were the most convinced that unity and hope was possible. For example, our country lost a hero recently in John Lewis, and I can't think of a more hopeful, unifying figure than him. And so, union is about the voices of the people we met along the way. This recent outburst of activism, I hope is just a recommitment to what we were hearing out there. I think for too long, those voices and those voices in particular have been out of the sort of larger dialogue in this country, and now it's coming to the fore. And so, this moment is born of a tragedy and hopefully deepening the possibility of the future, for the future.
I hope so. And I just want to highlight the Politics and Prose just put in the chat a link to buy Chris and Jordan's book. Please do that. Buy, and don't just buy it for yourself. Buy it for your friends, your family, your neighbors, anyone who you think could really use a dose of hope and thoughtful conversation. It's really a great book to read right now. And I also want to remind folks to please, as we're going, just put questions that you might have in the Q&A function, and we'll get to them in about 10 minutes. So,
Sarah, can I quickly add, Union pairs very well with Here All Along, which is also a wonderful book written by Sarah Hurwitz. So, if you're looking for two books.
You're very kind. I mean, they're so related. A book about
exactly.
How speechwriter writes about Judaism, a book you guys write about politics. Yeah, no,
100%.
Totally makes sense.
Synergy
right there. Thank you. You both kind of mentioned coming away with a sense of hope and optimism, which is definitely evident in the book. Then a global pandemic hits, right? Road trip is done, book is done, it's coming out, and now we are deep in COVID. After everything that we've been through in 2020, which, man, what a year, are you guys still hopeful?
Yes. The one-word answer is yes. The longer answer is 2020, especially this pandemic, has, I think, deepened and accelerated a lot of the crises that we write about in the book, whether that's inequality in all of its forms, drug addiction, the criminal justice system being broken. I mean, it's just everything is coming to the fore. And of course, that is the opposite of a hopeful thing. That is what terrified me when we first set out. But at the same time, I think it's being met on the local level by an equal force, which is the work of that nation of workers, of the people who care about the future of this country. So, something I often think back to is, I was stuck in New York when the shelter in place first came down. And I remember one day making dinner and then being hit with this wall of noise and looking outside and seeing this entire neighborhood of thousands making as much noise as possible. And when I looked it up, it was 7 o'clock, and it was to honor all of the essential workers. And just that cacophony, that wall of noise was just such a reminder of, what Mimi's work and Rodrigo's work and Franny's work, who organized the Shakespeare in Prison program that we spent time with at Parnell Prison outside Detroit. And so, the story of COVID hasn't been fully written yet. I mean, who knows which act we're in, whether it's act 1 or act 3 or 4, depending on how long the story is. But I do think we have all of the potential to not just beat this and get back to where we were, but to use this crisis as an opportunity to continue to craft that more perfect union. So the short answer is yes. I think both Jordan and I are both very, very hopeful still. But I don't want to put words in Jordan's mouth. Jordan, what do you think?
You said it all. That was very well said.
Thanks, man.
Great. So I'm very curious, did either of your politics change as a result of your friendship? Jordan, did you move to the left on any issue? Chris, did you move to the right? Was there a moment when you guys changed the other person's mind?
Yeah, well, so the spoiler for the book is that Chris and I are still the same parties we were when we started. So I'm still a Republican, Chris is still a Democrat. But we do say that we made each other better Republicans and Democrats. Chris helped sharpen my views, and he showed me things that were blind spots for me before. And in our conversations and our arguments and long drives together, he made me a more empathetic, deeper, smarter version of the Republican that I want to be. And hopefully the same is true for Chris. I think there are a few issues where we did move each other on. I know for me, starting out, when we first started these trips, I generally had an attitude that was anti-activist. I was worried often that activism, while it could raise awareness of an issue, could lead to backlashes or harm to a community that was left to deal with the consequences long after the activists had moved on. And I was always worried about, who is left to bear the cost. And I think spending a lot of time with Chris and discussing the sort of the pluralism we have as American democracy, the role that activism plays in getting things on the agenda and bringing a voice to issues that otherwise would be totally ignored is crucial to moving us forward as a country. And so I've come around to be a much stronger supporter of peaceful activism and recognizing the vital role it plays. And so that's one big issue that he moved me on. I think another is my approach to criminal justice. I think when we started, I had a lot of sympathy for law enforcement, having come from a military background. I still do. I still feel strongly about our men and women who serve the country, either as police or firefighters or in uniform overseas. But I also now see a lot of the injustice that is in the current system and how it can be overly harsh in certain areas. It can lead to a sort of vicious spiral where poverty is criminalized and makes it very hard for people to actually have a real second chance when they come out of prison. And I've actually adopted a lot of that into my day job with work. So it was kind of a powerful change that Chris helped me come to.
Well, I don't know if I deserve any credit for the former, but on the latter, that's a two-way street. The two of us had a lot of long conversations about our theories of change. And I spent too much time in college at the Daily Cal newsroom than in a philosophy classroom. So Jordan helped explain who, Edmund Burke is and the Burkean sort of philosophy, which, I don't call myself a Burkean like Jordan does, but I now see the importance of deliberative processes, of having process, of making progress, but making sure that there are many voices in the room and that everyone feels heard, and not losing our traditions, the ones that are good. And as Jordan says, he's made me a better liberal in the way that I hope I've made him a better Republican. And I'm still working on him though. I still feel like I got a shot.
Excellent. So we have a lot of audience questions, and I would ask, just keep putting your questions in the Q&A. There are a lot of great questions. I think it's about 6:40. We're going to turn to these. So one question, which comes from Rich Ramsey, he asks, other than Tulsa, what location were you most surprised by and why?
That's a really good question. Thank you. I would mention Detroit I don't know if surprise is the right word, so I apologize if this isn't fully answering your question, but Detroit had always loomed large in my sort of understanding of the country. My godfather, Dan Johnson, grew up just outside Detroit. I had been hearing my entire life about concerts, Motown concerts he'd sneak off to on Friday nights, and this bastion of American it's an American middle class engine. I mean, with the auto industry, and Michigan generally had sort of played a large role in my sort of early development, political thinking. And so for the first time ever, I went with Jordan. And to actually see this city long after the golden age of Detroit, and to see what remained of it, what was being made new, the problems, as well as, again, the hope and the desire to rebuild the city in a different image. That was phenomenally interesting to me because of my long sort of mental relationship with the place, and then to see it physically was really something. And there's amazing food up there too. Shout out to Chartreuse, where we went for my birthday dinner a couple of years ago. And so not only was it an education generally, and sort of urban renewal, and city, the history of this great city, but it was delicious as well.
All right.
I think for me, it would be New Orleans. I had never been to New Orleans before. For anyone who's been there, it's a magical city, and whatever my expectations were, it far surpassed it. And I do think we have a chapter on New Orleans, so I don't want to spoil it, but I do think the future of America is in New Orleans. It's just such an incredible melting pot that's producing this fascinating, beautiful culture that's very generative. And so we feel pretty strongly that New Orleans is this special place.
Nice. So Chase Sova asks, we spent a lot of time in the aftermath of the 2016 election thinking about the so-called rural-urban divide. From your 20,000 miles, how real does this divide feel in practice? Do you have examples of those two worlds finding common ground?
Well, first of all, Chase, hello, man. It's good to hear from you. It's been a while. That's a really good question. Jordan, do you have any initial thoughts?
Yeah, well, so a quick story that dramatizes this. In 2016, when we were on our first road trip, we were driving through Idaho, and Chris was driving, and he's normally the cautious driver, but he was going about 90 on these wide open highways, and he gets pulled over by an Idaho state trooper, and the state trooper comes over and starts questioning him, and gets very confused why Chris has a DC driver's license and I have a California driver's license, and my car has New York plates, and we're on a cross-country road trip from New York City to Los Angeles, and it just didn't make sense to him. And he was sure that we were doing something wrong. And so he ends up interrogating Chris for 40 minutes in his truck, and accuses him of drug running. And Chris is shaking and a little terrified. And we ultimately end up getting over the situation when the cop comes to interrogate me and finds out that I'm a veteran, and immediately his demeanor changed, and he shakes my hand, and he ends up sending us on our way. But the one thing he kept saying to us over and over again was, none of this makes any sense. Like, I don't understand why you would be doing this. He couldn't put two and two together. And whatever we were doing was so outside of his reality that he thought there was something wrong. And to us, that just dramatized this divide between Americans, that he couldn't understand us. We couldn't understand why he was so confused. And there is this separation between, I think, educated coastal elites who end up hopping from coast to coast, and it's very natural to go between schools or go between big cities, and people who really make their life in a single community and serve that community. And so we definitely saw that divide in various places. I think it's made more of than might be actually there, because in the end, we were still able to find lots of reasons to get along with all the people we met in these rural areas. I also think a lot of people who are struggling in rural parts of America to find jobs and to carve out a living in a really hard economy that's oriented towards knowledge workers and creative workers today have a lot in common with people in low-income communities and cities where they're similarly struggling to find jobs. I think there's a lot of commonality there. And so I think the divide is really much more of a class divide than a rural urban one, where there's just such a growing separation between well-educated elites who can be insulated, especially today with COVID, versus people who can't.
Yeah, I'll just say there's a coda to that story, which is after that police officer let us go, which we understand we were very fortunate to get off with just a warning. I said, I'm done driving. And I got over into the passenger seat, and Jordan took over the duties. And the very next day, we were driving through a small town called Daniel, Oregon. And Jordan decided to pass a tractor trailer in a middle lane, and we got pulled over again. And this cop asked us the same questions. Why is your license from California? His is from DC. You say you're both living in Connecticut. The car is registered to someone in New York. And he scratches his head and says, none of this makes any sense. And of course, Jordan and I have the same thought, which is that's what the last cop said. But we kept it to ourselves.
That is great. So there are two process questions. I'm just going to ask them together. The first one is about, let me just scroll down. This is from Holly Zanvil, who asked, how did you select the locations to visit? And did you have them all identified before you embarked on all of them? And the second one is actually about the process of writing a book, which is from Kyle Edwards, who asks, what was the process of co-writing the book like? How did you do it?
Well, Kyle can probably answer that question. Good to see you. Beautiful. Hi, that's my girlfriend. I'll handle that second one and just say, the co-writing process can be quite difficult. We both of us at a certain point during the process of writing this book looked up advice on how do you co-author a project, and the number one piece of advice was don't. Thankfully, we looked at this advice too deep in to actually take that advice. But look, Google Docs was massive for us. Jordan and I often were living on different coasts, and so the ability to edit a document at the same time was critical. The ability to iterate was also magnificently helpful. Jordan is a brilliant thinker. And his ability to sort of take disparate pieces of information and make an argument is unparalleled. And so the ability to sort of, I'm writing a story, I'm saying, here's a beginning, middle, and end. And Jordan says, well, you don't have much of an end here. It's definitely about this. And here's how we can sort of funnel it throughout. And so Jordan brought something really special to the project. I hope I brought something, and the ability to sort of merge those through time and massaging and talking it out. Jordan and I talk on almost a daily basis. Probably twice or three times daily during the writing process, which Kyle was privy to. And so it was a lot of work, but it was extremely rewarding. Ultimately, I think if I had done 6 road trips across nearly 20,000 miles alone, I would have had far less than half the insights that we did together.
Well, one of the great things about writing with your best friend is that he gets to talk you up on the book talks. And I'll reciprocate and say that whenever anyone reads the book, all the beautiful language comes from Chris. So that's all him.
And that comes from Sarah. So thank you, Sarah.
Not true.
To the first question, the road trips were usually some combination of serendipity and planning. So our first few road trips were almost entirely serendipity. There was something we wanted to see, a national park we wanted to go to, or a city we hadn't seen before. And we just decided to head that way. And then along the way, we met various people and ended up having great experiences with them and seeing where those experiences took us. By the third road trip, we were beginning to have a book in mind. And so we became much more deliberate about what we wanted to see. And there were parts of American life that we thought were important to go track down. So we wanted to go with a long haul trucker. We wanted to experience what it was like to be ensnared in the criminal justice system. We wanted to go explore the lobster industry in Maine because Chris had read about it in a property course in law school. And so those were all deliberate, and we set off to go find specific stories, but we always kept open the ability to have serendipity hit us, and it often did. So the book is a nice combination of the two.
And there's actually one more process question that just popped up from Susan Weintraub, which is, how difficult was it for both of you to agree on a book title?
Oh, so we went back and forth for a while. We played with some really bad names around like the road, so like changing lanes and something like that. But one day Chris called and said, "I've got it. The title should be Union," and like it was instant agreement from me. So it actually it was pretty quick and easy.
Nice. So I'm going to ask two related questions, one of which is from Bob Ferguson, who asked, did you have any extended conversations with hardcore Trump supporters? If so, how did those go? What did you learn from them? And then Ed Daring asks a kind of related question. He's more specific. He says, did you ask the trucker, Pete, why he wore the shirt? You know, based on all the disagreements he seems to have with the things that Trump espouses, was he wearing it as a statement that his beliefs, not Trump's, are what would make America great? Or like, what was your, with these Trump supporters, what were you finding?
Absolutely. Well, so let me see if I can get the quote right. He told us very explicitly why he wore the shirt. And he said that he wanted to make it red so they knew where to aim, which was his joke. He has a very wry sense of humor. Yeah, I think he was wearing it as a statement in part, and a conversation starter. I took it almost as a threat at first before I got to know him. But I mean, this goes back to our strategies. I mean, time against the problem, as one of my journalism mentors always says. The longer you spend with someone, the more you start to understand the depth of their thinking. And Pete was one of the most complex thinkers I think we've come across. It was not a threat, not even close. It was definitely a conversation piece, a provocative one, but a conversation piece nonetheless. And how did it go? We were able to find a lot of common ground, which is the phrase of the day, with people like Pete. In large part because we started talking about issues other than politics. And then by the time we got to politics, there was this baseline of trust. And there was this ability to talk openly in a way that we might not have had just an hour, 2 hours a day before. I remember the first thing that Pete said about politics was, we had asked him about Trump, and he's going into fourth gear in this huge diesel engine. And he says, you know what? I really wish you talked more about climate change. It's so important that we talk about climate change. And of course, here we are in this gas guzzling vehicle. So there's a lot of complexity to his thinking, and we were able to get there because we were able to talk about everything. I remember having, truck driving takes, every bit of you to get through every day. I mean, we started well before dawn. We often finished well after dark. And it allows all of this time for really deep thought and really deep exchange. And that was probably the best conversation we had with Trump supporters, was with Pete. But we had others. Jordan, anything come to mind? I mean, the veterans and Page certainly come to mind for me.
Yeah. Well, I think to the question, to answer directly, I think Pete said on many occasions that he liked the president because he said what's on his mind, and he used much more colorful language than I will on this talk. But there was something about that really mattered to him, and I think we've all seen the contradiction where the president uses exaggeration or lies, and yet people think he's saying exactly what's on his mind. And I think underneath it, what at least I came to take from it was, especially for someone like Pete, there was just this distrust for regulators and politicians who he's heard talk for 30 years and just doesn't really feel that they have his interests at heart or acting forthrightly about what they're trying to do for the country or the effect it has on people like him. And so for whatever else he thought about Trump's policies, I think there was a feeling that this guy is not a normal politician, and that's what I want. That's what he was resonating to. And it allowed him to disagree on every issue and still wear that shirt and tell us that he supported the president.
Although I wonder what Pete thinks now. We just exchanged a few messages with Pete today with the launch of the book. So I will, whoever asked that question, we'll get back in touch with Pete and we'll see how he thinks now.
So I'm going to ask just a couple more questions. First one, just following up a little bit on what Jordan, you were saying, what based on what you've learned, what do you think are the biggest mistakes that political candidates are making right now when they're talking to voters? This is from Rohan Pavluri. It's a really interesting question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you saw with someone like Andrew Yang, for instance, that there was just a general sense that he was going to say exactly what he thought. There was no sort of market testing of ideas. There was no focus groups telling him the exact right way to capture this constituency and that constituency. And there seemed to be a genuine belief that regardless of what you think about universal basic income, that he was really passionate about this and he was going to keep pushing it forward. And I think the same was true in some ways with Donald Trump when he ran in 2016. It was just this very clear sense of here's the thing I'm going to focus on. Here's what I really think, and it's probably not going to fit whatever market testing is being handed out by consultants, but that's what he's going to go with. And there's just something about that forthrightness and courage to take the arrows for hard positions that I think voters are responding to. And so I guess if I could whittle it down, it would just be to have more courage on certain issues that people tend to skirt around in various ways because it might offend some constituency they need to get.
Yeah, I would agree with Jordan. I'd call it authenticity. And I think one of the most authentic politicians we've had in a very long time was Barack and Michelle Obama. And I think strangely, there's a thread there, in many ways, because, when voters look at a leader and say, this person is saying what's on their mind, they're saying what they believe, they have the courage to say what they believe. Whether it's true or not, if that's their perception of it, that's I think what's lacking often in a lot of our leaders.
So final question, which I'm going to actually combine two questions. The first is, what are the core values that you found are common among all Americans, regardless of party or geographic location? What values or beliefs do we all share? And then another one, which I loved, it's sort of related, but not really, but I just want to know, which is from Chad Edwards. Jordan and Chris, do you have any future collaborations planned? So those will be our last two questions. You can answer them together.
So for the first question, I think what we found just across the board was everyone we engaged with on the road had a deep well of feeling about the country. Whether it was anger or love or reverence or disgust, like it just aroused strong feelings. And I think that's important to us because it means there's real passion and investment around the country. So there's that deep feeling. I think we also generally saw a spirit of hospitality and kindness and generosity wherever we went. But some of the things that we felt were more unique, the one that really sticks out is this idea of redemption. And we think this is something we just saw over and over and over again, that Americans believe strongly in this idea of second chances, that everybody deserves a second chance, no matter where they came from, regardless of national origin or their history or parents or things they've done, that everyone deserves a second chance. And that idea of redemption is powerful. I think it's one of the reasons why criminal justice reform is now a bipartisan issue, because it does resonate on this very deep level with most Americans. Chris, is there anything you'd add?
Yeah, the other one I'd add is the desire to be treated with dignity. It's something we heard often, whether it was men in Parnell about to come back into becoming returned citizens, coming back into Detroit, or whether it's Pete talking about not just regulators, but the companies that dispatch him. There's this deep desire for just basic human dignity, to feel that way, feel treated that way by leaders and people they may never meet, as well as just, who you meet on the road. To Chad's question, hey, Chad, I think I'm going to leave you with a little bit of a riddle, which is we are thinking about another project, and we're either going to go south or we're going to go east.
Mysterious. All right. Well, guys, this was wonderful. Everyone must buy this book right now. For everyone you know, especially buy it from Politics and Prose, because they are an amazing local DC bookstore. We love them, all of us. So Thank you guys so much. This is really hopeful. It's inspiring. Your book really, it's a bright spot at a very dark time. So I think it's a perfect book to read right now.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much. And Politics and Prose, thank you as well. This is so nice, and it's our favorite bookstore. So we're thrilled to get to do this with you.
Agreed on all fronts.
Jordan, Chris, Sarah, thank you so much for sharing this with us tonight. We're so happy to have hosted you, and thank you also to everybody tuning in at home. There are a ton of people in the audience tonight, and we really appreciate that. The book link for Union is in the chat, as is the book link for Here All Along. Just if you scroll up a little bit, and it really is those. Book sales that are keeping our doors open right now. So we thank you for them. We encourage you to make more of them for us. And we hope that you stay well and stay well read. Good night, everybody. Sarah, Jordan, Chris, that was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Joy.